All right, thank you for coming out this afternoon. With us today we have Dr. Nathan Tye. He is Assistant Professor of Nebraska and American West History at University of Nebraska Kearney, where he's taught since 2019. It seems like it's been longer.
Yeah, I'm an associate.
Well, you need to update your bio. He received his PhD from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, I can't even talk, and his research focuses on lives of migrant laborers, better known as hobos. You might remember he did a presentation for us a few years ago, and their efforts to survive on society's margins. Dr. Tye serves on the boards for several local community museums and cultural organizations. His research is published in Nebraska History, Annals of Iowa, the Willa Cather Review, and he's appeared on NBC's Celebrity Genealogy program, Who Do You Think You Are? And I'm going to add one more thing too. So Nathan has also been instrumental in helping us get our last screening of the Kaufman documentary that's going to be at the World Theater in Kearney on Sunday, November 17th at 7 o'clock. And that is being sponsored by the UNK Department of History and the Trails and Rails Museum in Kearney. So thank you for that, and thank you, Nathan, for being here.
I have to say I'm always excited when I get a call or a text message from Michelle about something. That either means she's discovered something really cool in a basement or in a closet or what have you. And I need to come over and immediately look at it. But I want to thank Michelle, I want to thank the Hall County Historical Society for having me today. We're going to have a lovely conversation about something that you might have a vague sense. I know Michelle has written about it in the Grand Island Independent, but I'm going to show you some photos and some other things that come from the first and hopefully only serial killer in central Nebraska. Fingers crossed. And so, as my title suggests, I want to focus on the crimes and times of Stephen D. Richards. Everybody hear me? Okay. His violence captivated the state during the second full decade of homesteading and colonization, a period that tested the nascent legal system and its law enforcement arms. Richards committed gruesome crimes in Nebraska and Iowa, murdering 9 men, women, and children during his lifetime. His crimes of unprecedented confession transfixed the nation and endured in local lore and myth well into the 20th century. The last living witnesses to the crime actually passed away in the 1940s. So much closer than we'd like to think. Stephen D. Richards traveled and worked under a number of names that we know of. William Hudson, F.A. Hogue, Gallagher, doesn't give us a last name or a first name, just Gallagher. Contemporary press accounts deemed him the Nebraska Monster, or the Nebraska Fiend. And he claimed the, quote, peculiarities of this prince of murderers are well worth the study of a scientist. And he was a distinctive man for his era. He was 170 pounds and 6'3". We actually have a couple of photos of him. On the left is him in his prime, and on the right is him after he's been captured. A commentator found that, quote, at prison he was pretty generally considered a handsome man, although his features were too coarse for that. His eyes were steel gray, almost blue, very keen and penetrating, and withal restless and suspicious, which is something what the surviving photos do give us of him. Richards was born in Wheeling, Virginia in 1856. This will later, during the Civil War, become Wheeling, West Virginia. As a child, his family moved to neighboring Ohio, and he tells us that his parents were not strict, but that his mother used her influence over me like a Christian woman, and I regularly attended Sunday school. Recall Richards in his confession. Curiously, in this document, he does not say anything about his father. Read into that what you will. Only about his mother. She died when he was about 15, and he also tells us that I was a little wild at times, and sometimes attended dances and other evening entertainments, but did nothing positively wrong while there. Yet an anecdote that he shares in his confession points to his disregard for life, and I apologize for what I'm about to share with you. When I was a boy, I was sent out to kill a litter of kittens, and I did it by striking their heads against a tree, smashing out their brains one by one. I didn't feel bad about it at all. It was fun. I experienced the same sort of feeling when I killed those 3 little Harlson kids, just as soon as strangled so many kittens or brained them. against a tree. So as we're going to see, Richards is fairly unrepentant about what he will commit later in life. As a young man, Richard worked around farms and others in Ohio and became engaged to a young woman, Anna Milhorn. Soon, though, he began engaging in criminal activities and opened a correspondence, as he tells it, with a number of bad men in the West, and begins passing counterfeit money, which he buys in New York City. In 1876, he headed west for opportunity, first stopping in Illinois, and then moving across the river to Burlington, Iowa, where he stayed with a gentleman by the name of William Lee, who was a local brothel owner, who would later be hung by the state of Iowa for murdering one of his employees. He then found work as an attendant at the Iowa Lunatic Asylum in Mount Pleasant, but soon took up, as he would tell us, tramping the state in a regular style and passed through Kansas City, Hastings, and then the 3-year-old community of Kearney Junction. There's not actually any evidence that he spends any time in Grand Island, so you're all safe. During his time at Kearney, he killed his first known victim. Riding north, he met another rider south of town. As darkness fell, they set up camp between Dobbiestown, which was a small community west of Fort Kearney. This is actually a map of Dobbiestown that was done by the daughter of a resident. That is in the collection of materials at the State Historic Site now at Fort Kearney. So very small community, hotel, a couple of, there's a blacksmith shop, some bars, some adobe sheds where gambling was going to happen. Really pleasant place. And so he sets up for the night between Dobbiestown and then between the river, or the bridge over the Platte River. And the pair played cards around the campfire, and Richards tells us that by one nearly all the stranger had. Angered, the stranger accused Richards of cheating and brought it up again as they headed north to Kearney in the morning. Quote, "Either give me back my money or fight," he reportedly told Richards. A fight ensued, and Richards shot the man above the left eye. After killing him, I dragged him down to the Platte River and pitched him in. He then took the victim's horse, traded it in for another one in Kearney, and went south to Phelps County until stuff cooled down. A few days later, he came upon another stranger near the river who inquired about his friend, with whom Richards had been seen prior to his disappearance. Spooked, Richards shot the man in the back and disposed of the body, presumably again in the river. Now, is when we drive over the Platte River, when we go by the Platte River, it's not the mighty, mile wide and a foot deep that it used to be. But this map, this is 1868, this is a military map that was done for Fort Kearney. We actually do get a sense of how wide and large the river was, and so you could very easily dispose of the body or make someone disappear in all of this water and sand. After murdering these two men, he headed to Kearney again. And along the way, he stopped at the Harrelson family homestead. And this was a family that he had known, Jasper Harrelson and his wife, Mary. And Mary, the wife, asks him if he's been in a fight. I asked her why she asked me that question, Richards would tell us, and she replied, "There was blood on my shirt bosom and collar. I did not know it and was startled, but remarked in a joking way that it must be blood of some of the men I had murdered." The subject was then dropped. So there's a little bit of foreshadowing that we see. Richards did not to stay around the area that long after both of these murders. He went west to Cheyenne and traveled kind of along the communities along the Union Pacific Railroad in the west. I do not remember all that I did in Cheyenne, but I passed the time principally with the boys, that he tells us. Don't know who the boys are. I think that I had my share of fun. Then Richard moves to Kansas City, where he was determined to reform, and found farm work outside the city, although soon he was on the road again to Iowa, where he bought a stranger's buggy and horse outside Cedar Rapids. And he purchased it with counterfeit money that the seller quickly discovered. The next day, when the seller realized what he had, he confronted Richards, who promptly shot him and buried him outside Cedar Rapids. And then he fled to Lincoln with the intent to get back to Kearney, where hopefully things have cooled off from his other two murders. So we're up to 3 people, right? We've got 6 to go. At this point, Richard had murdered, 4 people, 3 in 2 people in the city of Kearney and 1 in Iowa. Back in town, he registered at a local hotel under the name of F.A. Hogue and was briefly jailed on suspicion of murder, but for somebody else. And he was actually released because he was not actually connected to this murder. And we do know then that he kind of stayed in the area. We know he was arrested in June of 1878 for larceny in Kearney. And there he reconnected with Mary Harrelson, the woman who had asked about his bloody shirt some time before. She herself was in the Buffalo County Jail because she had aided and abetted in the escape of her husband from the Buffalo County Jail. Her husband had been imprisoned for stealing wood from the bridge in going over the Platte River. And this is actually one of the few bits of evidence we have for the Harrelson family themselves. There's very little evidence. We don't know where they're buried. We don't have, this is the only newspaper clipping prior to the murders where we actually have some documentation that the Harrelsons are there, and it's just a description of the husband leaving and escaping from the jail. While Mary and Stephen D. Richards were in jail, the pair agreed to a financial arrangement that Richards would buy the Harrelson family homestead for $600. But he would have to wait 6 months because they still had to prove it up. So they weren't able to pay it off just quite yet. And upon release, Richards found some work in the area and then eventually moved on to the Harrelson family homestead. And so in October of 1878, we can find him at the homestead. One of the interesting things in doing this research is, again, the Harrelson family is really poorly documented, but we have the original blueprints for the bridge he stole pieces off of, which is unusual. This is actually one of the oldest county documents we have for Buffalo County, is the bridge that the Harrelsons were stealing off of. The Harrelson homestead was typical for the period, a 2-room sod house, one for the family with 2 beds and a crib, and the other contained a kitchen. And again, we don't have a lot of evidence, but generally is going to look like, kind of similar Solomon Butcher images that we have for Custer County in the same time period. The 4 members of the family were typically at home. Mary and her 3 children, Daisy, who's 10, Mabel, who's 4, and Jesse, who's the youngest, who's just 2. There's also a hired hand by the name of Brown. Really the only description we kind of have of him is his name. From about mid-October, October 18th to be precise, until the murder on November 3rd, he lived with the family. And in that time, he begins to disclose things about himself to Mary as he gets more comfortable living with the family. Mary also gets a little suspicious of him, and at one point breaks into his trunk and starts reading all of his letters, where he describes all of his previous crimes, including the murders. So when he asks why he murdered her, he will say, first, she talked too much, and second, she was too inquisitive. Third, she would have given me away had I let her live. So you kind of see the tension building in the household. You've got a murderer in and among your children, you're growing suspicious, and assuredly accusations are beginning to fly in this house. On the morning of the murder, November 3rd, 1879, Richard sent Brown to the stable for his chores while he dug a grave for the family in a field. Picking up an axe placed near the door, he went about his horrid business. He first murdered Mary, the mother, then the 2 children asleep beside her before killing the final child. All were asleep and none stirred, as he tells us, as he dispatched them. Within 30 minutes, he killed the whole family, disposed of the bodies, washed up, and left for Hastings with the field hand, who was unaware that his employer and her children were dead. When they got to Hastings, he had Brown, he paid off Brown and said, hey, you're done, I'm taking over the homestead. Here's a little bit of cash. And Brown was never heard of again. Richards returns to the homestead and continued to live there as nothing had happened. And when people began to inquire, he said that the wife and the children ran off with the farmhand. That's my house. In early December, while he's still living at his previous crime scene, he finds work with a Swedish homesteader by the name of Peter Anderson, who lived outside the small Kearney County community of Fiend, which is now almost a ghost town. There's an elevator. And Anderson wanted him to build some sod outbuildings for his homestead. He's a young bachelor farmer, he's just looking for help. And the Anderson homestead was about 5 miles from the Olson homestead, where the bodies still lay undiscovered. While Richard worked, Anderson became sick and accused the former of poisoning him. And this is the site of the Anderson homestead. I can tell you that the afternoon I stopped, I think I spooked the farmer a little bit. You can see his truck back here, because I was out taking photos of his field, because there was a murder that took place there some time ago. Yeah, I don't know if he knew or not. Kind of wanted to ask him if once stuff was out of the ground, if we could walk around, but Anderson tells us Richards tells us that Anderson became sick and he accused Richards of poisoning him. And the two fought over dinner over this issue. And in the course of dinner, then Anderson actually reached for an axe, but Richards was quicker and grabbed a hammer, which he brought down on Anderson's head. I pushed the body aside and sat down and ate my dinner, reported Richards. He then carried Anderson, who was still alive, to the cellar where he finished him off and buried him beneath coal and clay. As he came upstairs, he found Anderson's neighbors peering in the window, looking for Anderson. And as you'll know, Phelps County and Kearney County, there's a large Swedish community. And Peter Anderson has a great many Swedish brethren who he knows and are kind of keeping an eye on him as a young bachelor farmer. So they're a little suspicious when Peter's not around. As he came upstairs and he sees the neighbors, they accuse him. They ask him, well, where's Peter? They leave, and Richards remains in the house, presumably cleaning up the vitriol that is across the room. And they returned with more men and began questioning Richards as to Peter's whereabouts. He knew they would find the body soon, as he had only heaved him in a pile of coal in the cellar, and so he fled immediately, first to Hastings, where he gets on a train and gets to Red Cloud and then heads east. As Richards fled, Anderson's body was found, and shortly thereafter the Harlson family was found as well. The news reached those on the train, quote, "If Richards is on the train, he's a damn fool if he don't get off," declared a passenger, not knowing that Richards was sitting next to him. We only know that because Richards tells us that this is what's going on the train. The conductor even sat with Richards and talked about the murders with him. Yeah, not knowing what's going on. Presumably the local Swedish community came together to honor Peter Anderson of the victims. He's the only one with an identifiable and known grave. The unusual thing, for those of you who've spent time in rural cemeteries, we don't usually have the cause of death. Peter Anderson, murdered December 9th, 1878, aged 26 years. And this is the back, at the back of the small church, just south of the ethanol plant over by Exdale. Just kind of off by itself, but with very clearly with the cause of death, more likely taken through a collection from members of the parish and the local Swedish community. As Richards is discussing all of this on the train and fleeing, he eventually gets home to Ohio. He was concerned about his discovery because he tells us that he carried a pair of revolvers just in case the police found him. And they did. It was not there long when one day, while in company of two young ladies on our way to attend a party, I was arrested. He was then quickly sent back west. Now, Richards was detained by Captain David Anderson. He'd been an officer in the Indiana Cavalry during the Civil War. David Anderson, the first sheriff of Buffalo County, and S.L. Martins of Adams County. The pair then transported him back to Nebraska for trial, and news of his passage west was relayed to local papers. Now, when the trio passed through Grand Island, and this is Grand Island 1880, so we're roughly, really close to what the city would have looked like, and passing through the Union Pacific to the southwest, When the trio passed through Grand Island, the paper reported, quote, that Richards was asleep at the time of the arrival of the train, and we did not get a chance to say anything to him about his horrible butcheries. In Grand Island, though, while we're here, Sheriff Anderson received an urgent telegram from his wife, Margaret Anderson, that a mob was forming outside the Kearney depot with full intent to lynch him, that a noose was already hung over the telegraph pole. So be prepared. Anderson told his wife to meet him at Buda with a team of fast horses and a buggy. And this is a story that their son Hector would tell for quite some time. And those who might not remember Buda, it's the small little ghost town just by the Kearney airport. She met the train, and Richards was hauled off and shackled to a wagon, his feet to the iron footrest and his hands to the side of the seat. The train crew tried to get to the Buda telegraph operator to send news of the unscheduled handoff. But Sheriff Anderson threatened them with arrest if the mob was informed about what was going on. The crew then sped off, hoping to outrace the buggy. So you have the sheriff's wife with a 9-time murderer chained to the buggy, trying to outrace a Union Pacific train down what is, now Highway 30. You can imagine this is just perfect for a movie. The train overshot the depot. They were trying to go too fast, giving her just enough time to make it to jail without the knowledge of the mob. When the mob rushed down to the jail, they found it surrounded by shotgun-wielding deputies. And the Buffalo County Jail in this time period this was the Old Stone Jail, which existed for far too long before they replaced it at the present location of the courthouse. Returns to Nebraska, Sheriff Martin says Richards will have a fair trial and there's no danger of him being mobbed as the people are law-abiding. And so he wasn't lynched. This is part of the thing, that we have this idea of frontier justice, but what this story actually tells us with this horrible crime is that the people of Nebraska adhered to the rule of law. He was going to get a fair trial. He wasn't going to get lynched, despite what he did. And curiously, we have a few stories about Richard's time in the Buffalo County Jail, which is not necessarily the space that you would think would be documented. To give you a rough sense, we don't actually have any photos of the interior of the Buffalo County Jail. This is actually the blueprints for the county jail, the Dawes County Jail at Chadron, which gives you a vague sense of kind of what a cell. You've got bunks, a tin bathtub, water closet, wash basin. So not swanky by any means. The sheriff's eldest son, Charles Anderson, was 6 at the time, and he liked to play sheriff. He liked to be deputy sheriff. And they would give him little tasks to do around the jail. The family also lived above the jail as well. And he would help lock the prisoners up at night, which usually went fine. But you've got Richards in the jail. And he was also typically tasked with filling the coal stove. And mind you, this is January 1879, so it's a little chilly, right? And they would leave the door open then to heat the cells coming off the potbelly stove that was in the middle. While all the deputies stood around warming themselves, Richards shouted at little Charles that I would kill you as soon as a rabbit. You can imagine this, the terrified 6-year-old ran upstairs and hid under the covers and stopped playing deputy. Sheriff Anderson also had his own issues beyond abusing his son. When moving Richards into another cell, as we see actually, he became sulky and refused to enter cell. Sheriff Anderson told him that if he did not walk into the room before he counted 4, he would blow the top off his head. And Richards refused to move, and the sheriff counted to 4 and put a bullet above his head, and Richards moved. So he was a difficult prisoner, to say the least. And this was something, again, that the members of the Anderson family were still telling the children of the Anderson family. So this is a letter from 1958. The youngest of the Anderson kids wrote to Maury Sandoz telling them about this story. So almost 80 years after this happened, this young boy was regaling to Maury the stories of what was going on in the jail cell in Buffalo County. The trial in Minden was short. After he was transferred out of the Buffalo County Jail, Kearney County didn't have jail at the time. He was put before District Judge William Gaslin. Richards was charged with the murder of Peter Anderson. 7 witnesses testified to what they found in the Anderson homestead. Richards was then put on the stand, and in the process admitted to killing Anderson, but argued it was done in self-defense. That Anderson was reaching for an axe during a fight and he didn't have a choice but to do it. And he tells us on the stand that he called me a liar and I knocked him down. He got up and I knocked him down again with a hammer. He started to pick up an axe. I would not be called a liar by anybody on earth. After I knocked him down, I carried him into the cellar and covered him with coal. I killed him because he called me a liar. I hit him some, twice or 3 times. When handed the hammer in question by the prosecution, he identified it as the murder weapon. And so you can imagine the jury had a very easy decision to make and quickly returned with a guilty verdict, and Richards was sentenced to hang on April 26, 1879. After the trial, Richards was sent to the state penitentiary. That was deemed the ideal space to put him around in Buffalo County. And it was there that he confessed to all of his crimes over 2 days to Dillman Prosper Ashburn, an acquaintance from Gibbon and a former state senator. So this is Ashburn on the left. In late January 1879, they spent hours together, and the prisoner's deputy warden was also present and served as the witness to what Richards was disclosing. This confession was later edited and published as its own text. Its truthfulness cannot be doubted, noted the editor, though as the day of execution approached, Richards sought to soften his story. And he told his interviewer that I have killed 9 persons, and I can't feel any worse for it. I only have one wish in the world now. And what is that? Asked the confessor. I want to kill a preacher and a reporter. Real nice guy. And then when asked if he was afraid to be hung, he says, I'm not afraid because he'd had the taste of human blood before. Photos were taken for the publication of the confession and it appeared in the Nebraska State Journal. Unlike today, where it is done in the state penitentiary, so the county government and Minden had to build a gallows. And they were built on the courthouse square, on the southeast corner of the courthouse square. And I have brought it up, and they do not want to include this in the Christmas pageant, but I think, maybe a Halloween pageant. Yeah. In addition to being done where the crime had been prosecuted, these were also deemed to be private executions. The general public was not invited to actually witness what was going on. And so they actually had to pay local men to build a fence around the gallows so that you couldn't see it. And only ticketed witnesses were allowed inside. And we actually have, the State Historical Society has a ticket. Admit the bearer to the enclosure at Minden on April 26th to witness the execution of S.T. Richards.
Wow. How much were the tickets?
They weren't. You kind of had to be given it by somebody from the county government. You had to be associated in some capacity to get the ticket. Yet the scale and brutality of Richard's crimes drew 1,500 people to the courthouse square in Minden. Moreover, and understandably, the Swedish community in central Nebraska was a little angry and wanted to see this man hung. The crowd became increasingly agitated as the execution neared and began tearing the fence down around the gallows, which we have. This is as it appeared in the National Police Gazette, which was kind of a sensational true crime magazine in the 19th century. This is a better version of it where we see people actually tearing it down. And we also have a surviving diary from one of the young Swedish immigrants who tore down the fencing, and it's at the Nebraska History Museum in Oldridge. And he tells us, the sheriff and the guards did all in their power without resorting to violence. We finally made a break for the enclosure, and soon the boards commenced to fly, and in less than 5 minutes, 3 sides of the enclosure were razed to the ground. So the public was going to see this regardless of what the sheriff or the law said. With an agitated crowd and the possibility for violence, the county sheriff decided to ride Richards around the square on an open wagon to show him to everybody. flanked by deputized Swedish homesteaders before delivering him to the gallows. We also know, based on, we have descriptions of the execution, we also have a photo of the execution. This is one of the rare, rare treasures of Nebraska history. This is something that the University of Nebraska Kearney purchased just last year after I was able to track it down, and it is the only known photo of the execution. Harry Hatch, who was a local photographer, stood on a sod house 200 yards away and captured this scene, which is a stereograph. But if we zoom in, we can get a solid sense. We can see that they did tear down the barriers, right? And you can see the man right in the middle is Stephen D. Richards. Zoom in a little closer. And roughly matches the appearance of what we know he looked like after the execution. He was dropped through the trapdoor, and Richards gasped for air for 10 minutes before finally succumbing to death. He then was propped up in an open coffin, which the crowd passed, and a local photographer also photographed. This tintype also survives at the State Historical Society of Lincoln, so we can match that to the kind of blurry image we have of him on the gallows. Given the scale of Richard's violence, his public confession, the newness of Minden's role as the county seat, this is at the time when Minden steals the county seat from Lowell. Alongside contemporary views of the American West as a lawless space, it might surprise many of you that Richards wasn't lynched. The expectation in the West is a place where people take it into their own hands. Yet the American West, as one of my dear colleagues, Mark Ellis, writes, when he studied the law in Nebraska in this time period, was that Nebraskans did what they were most familiar with. They followed the letter of the law. The vast majority of homesteaders, the vast majority of settlers, these are people who had not been part of extrajudicial laws before. These are people who had served on juries. These are people who had come from back east with robust legal systems. They did what was known to them, which was fair trial by jury and execution. And as we've seen, there's a lot of artifacts that come with this, the spectacle of what he did. And that includes the rope. This is a chunk of the rope that's also at the State Historical Society, which we also know from the Grand Apple paper is selling really, really well. The rope that hung Richards is selling well in pieces as souvenirs. One of the wonderful things about this project, one of the infuriating things as well, is the Kearney press is very, very fragmentary for this time period. The Minden press is all but non-existent for this. The best newspapers are the Hall County newspapers in documenting what's going on. They're the best source for anything on Richards. Now, I don't want to say that he wasn't completely free from any sort of extrajudicial punishment. After his execution, he was buried east of Minden, and we know where, because there was a surviving witness in the 1940s who could give you quarter and section where the body was at, because he remembered. The next evening, his body was dug up and brought to an abandoned building in Minden, which we also know where it's at because the surviving witness tells us. And there, an unknown but presumably well-connected group of local men conducted an autopsy. And again, we don't know. We can assume the doctor, probably the judge, probably the sheriff, probably attorneys, probably a couple of reporters. Again, we don't know. Nobody tells us who was there. They deny that they were there. And we'll talk about what happens from there. But as any good county government, you need to get paid for all of this. We can see how much it cost. 1879, the Buffalo County Sheriff's budget was $1,700, and the next year it dropped out to $800. It was quite a sufficient expenditure of money to bring Richards to justice in deputies, in time, in And this is one of those things we don't have a lot of documentation about Richards in the Buffalo County Archive. Again, our county records are hit or miss. This is one of the few things that kind of, it doesn't directly say that Richards' wine was so expensive for 1879, but it is one of two major murder cases that they're dealing with because this is also happening at the same time as the Mitchell-Ketchum trial is also happening. And it was so expensive that they actually petitioned the legislature to get money to cost both the Adams County and the Buffalo County Sheriff to pay for going to Ohio and picking them up. And so they got $591 from the state to reimburse the sheriff for what they did. And the governor does approve this. Now, the story kind of ends somewhat because we still have a body that's been dug up and cut apart. Then where is Richards? Also from the Grand Island paper, the skeleton of S.P. Richards, the Buffalo County murderer, has been wired together and is now attracting the attention of all who visit Minden. Richards is a much better citizen now than he was a year ago. Now, there's a lot of wild speculation about what they do with him. Again, we know they dig him up. We know they conduct an autopsy. And then, what do you do with him, right? So the Grand Island paper from shortly thereafter says, well, yeah, he's still in Minden. He's just hanging out. The Minden Bee says, oh, how dare you say that. Our exchange are having a good deal to say about Richard's body being resurrected, boned, and his skeleton being bleached with lime and neatly wired, etc. But a few days ago, most of his bones were bleaching in a manure pile not more than 100 miles from our office. Every now and then, the doctor can be seen busily engaged in scraping a bone. And when they mean 100 miles from the office, they mean directly down below. The doctor being the devil. Richards is in hell, is what they're saying. Now, they don't deny the skeleton's there, but they're like, well, he's in hell. That still doesn't really respond to, is he wired up and hanging around Minden? And this will continue. It is now stated that Sheriff Martin of Adams County, who captured Richards, the hero of nine murders, adorns his office with the Fiend's skull. So again, nobody really knows where he ends up, just quite yet. And then 4 years later, the Kearney County paper says that several murders have been committed here. The circumstances have cast an undeserved shadow on the history of Kearney County. This is after some other murders. Zimmerman, who killed Richards, who committed several murders in Ohio, was from Ohio, and he was executed here, and his skull can be seen in the Gazette office. So now it's in the newspaper office, and this is the Gazette telling us that the skull is in their office. So it's clearly moving around town. And I have asked repeatedly people in Minden, does anybody have a skull lying around? You might not know what it is. I think it's probably Penry Village somewhere. They just don't know, honestly. And it will continue to be something that is spoken of in local lore. This is 1887, so this is 8 years afterwards, and this story is being told in the Kearney County paper. It's a really bad joke. At the time Richards was hung at this place among the large crowd of people in attendance, there was a little girl about 4 years old near the scaffold. She heard the condemned man make his speech, in which he said he hoped to give forgiveness and he hopes to meet all in heaven. Soon after the drop fell, the little 4-year-old girl asked her mother if she thought Richards went straight to heaven. The mother said she did not know. Well, if he did go straight to heaven, he's got God killed by this time, the child said. Yeah, this is 8 years later, so this little girl's 12, and there's no reason why you should be telling this story in the local paper, if not because Richards is still kind of a terrifying part of local Kearney County lore. So again, we don't know where the body went. We know what happened. We also don't know where the Harlesons are buried. There's a lot of mysteries yet for this trial. It is incredibly well documented for a crime of this time period with matter of the press, surviving material artifacts. I have been on the trail to get the actual court proceedings. They're in a basement. It's going to take a while. But we still don't know where Richards ended up. The other possibility is he's in the Hastings Museum, if he was with the sheriff. So there's a couple of places that he might have ended up. But I want to thank all of these repositories have material that was part of this presentation. And really the Hall County newspapers are the effort that digitizing the Hall County papers that were undertaken under your auspices that really made a a lot of this possible. So I want to thank you for that as well. So, questions? On a really gruesome topic, yeah.
How many kids can this person get killed?
9 people. 9 people, 3 children.
Oh my God.
Yep.
You said nobody knows where the Harlesons are.
Mhm.
Did they dig them up at the time?
It's
How
not
did they
in the
know that
local.
there were 4 people dead?
They found them, and
Well, they had been dug up somehow. Dug up.
And so they either buried them on the homestead, which the other difficult part is the land records don't really tell us where they were at either. I have a rough sense they're 5 miles outside Kearney, they're like 2 miles from Walker's Ranch, so they're kind of around Wilcox somewhere, vaguely.
A lot of ground.
So more likely than not, I'm guessing they buried them on the homestead fairly quickly. If it were near Walker's Ranch outside Wilcox, the Wilcox Cemetery is not far, but there are no graves documented for this period that could be these individuals. After the murders, the Harlesons kind of fall off. It's documented he did the murders. Nobody says anything about burying them. Nobody says anything about a funeral. I don't think they were attached to a church, whereas Peter has a burial, has a tombstone, and he's tried for that murder. He's not actually tried for the murder of the Harlesons. So it's, and then there's also some accusations from the Iowa press that he might have been dating or had a romantic relationship with her, predating her marriage.